Hello everyone, my name is Sagar Mamane and I am a senior technical support analyst working with BMC Discovery support team. This is our today's webinar topic. We are going to see a full process overview of discovering the Windows endpoints using BMC Discovery. So let's look at today's agenda. We will go through the introduction up to the troubleshooting steps, including the demo part, and we are going to see all the different components which are involved in discovering the Windows endpoints. So what is Windows Discovery and how does it work? Some of the audience which are joined here have functioning discovery environment. So I'm also going to assume that you have a discovery appliance installed and you have all the necessary credentials and everything configured to run a discovery scan. So an end-to-end process of discovering the Windows endpoints and inferring or creating the host node in BMC Discovery is basically what we call as Windows Discovery. Now, this is a high level process which I'll be explaining to you. So with this diagram, we will understand how Windows Discovery actually works. Now, Discovery will check whether the IP address is marked as one to avoid, that is, whether the IP address which you are trying to scan is in the list of excluded IPs. And if it is in the excluded IPs, it will stop the scan then and there. It will then check for previously successful logins or any credentials that were successfully used in the past. If they were used, then the same credentials will be reused and the scan will be performed. Discovery will also perform access methods using port scan. If there is no response, no further discovery attempt is made. From here, the remaining steps are attempted in a sequence, and when one is successful, the results are passed to the operating system or the OS heuristics in Discovery. Discovery then attempts to log in and run discovery commands if the credentials are available. It also performs SNMP get on the sys description OID. It performs an HTTP head request on the host. It tries to match the open ports to predict the class of the operating system. For example, if port 22 is found to be open, Discovery assumes that it is an SSH based machine or it is a Unix based machine. In the same way, if port 135 is found open, then Discovery will assume that it is a Windows operating system. So let's say the operating system is determined to be Windows. The credentials matching that IP address is then determined. And if that is an Active Directory credential, then the IP address is passed to the first Active Directory proxy as a request to scan that IP address. Outpost creates the AD proxy when AD credential is defined and need to be used for discovery. The Active Directory proxy will first try PowerShell method and then WMI and then RemQuery method to access the host. If it is unsuccessful, it informs Discovery service about the failure, and if it is successful, then the commands are run to determine the characteristics of the host, that is to discover additional details of the host. If the domain is returned, the next time host is scanned, the Active Directory proxy which is assigned that domain is called first. In this case, it will be the current Active Directory proxy. If the request is rejected, the IP address is passed to the next Active Directory proxy as a request to scan that IP address. After the IP address has been discovered and is in a known Active Directory domain, in case the matching credential machine with the IP is a Windows credential proxy, then the IP address is passed to the first available credential proxy for discovery. The credential proxy first tries WMI method and then RemQuery as a fallback method. It does not support PowerShell. In case the matching credential for the given IP is PowerShell credential, then the PowerShell access method based discovery is tried and can be done from the appliance as well as from the outpost. Now let's look at some different methods which are used in performing the discovery. So Windows endpoints can be discovered using these three commonly used methods, which are widely used: WMI and RemQuery. There is a reason why I have kept WMI and RemQuery together. We will understand it at the part of the demo. So WMI, which we all are aware, it is Windows Management Instrumentation. RemQuery is a BMC's utility that is copied to the endpoint's administrative share, and it runs locally with a temporary service. PowerShell, it's becoming very popular nowadays due to its simplicity of configuration. With PowerShell, there is a new concept of using JEA, which is just enough administration account, which is introduced by Microsoft, and it is included in Discovery since version 23.3 and above. SNMP, I have specified it, though it is a least used method to discover the Windows endpoints, but it is one of the supported methods. There are some pros and cons of using SNMP, so we are going to see that in the demo as well. Now let's understand some of the key components of Windows Discovery. So first is the credential proxy or AD proxy. So for the detailed discovery of the Windows part of the target environment, BMC Discovery uses a Windows proxy, a discovery proxy that can be installed on any suitable Windows computer in the target environment. There are two Windows proxy types available, and you can select it depending on whether you want to use it for the workgroup based endpoints or Active Directory or domain joined endpoints. The preferred approach is to use the Active Directory proxy installed as a service that is set to run as the discovery user. In this manner, a Windows administrator can set the username and password, and it has never to be known or entered by a BMC discovery administrator. It means you don't have to enter Active Directory proxy credential in discovery appliance. So once the Active Directory proxy is configured and a service is running with the specific credentials, then those credentials do not have to be entered in Discovery UI. Now, in the case of the credential or Windows proxy, usernames and password for discovery are entered into the appliance UI. The Windows proxy or credential proxy can be a physical or a virtual server, and it can use an existing infrastructure server as well. Now, what is an outpost? So, BMC Discovery Outpost is an application software that runs on a dedicated Windows server in your data center or on a public cloud, depending on where you're deploying it. A BMC Discovery Outpost can be registered with an appliance or multiple appliances or even clusters. The BMC Discovery appliance sends requests to a BMC Discovery Outpost to scan the IP addresses as required, and the BMC Discovery Outpost accesses the target by using the credentials that are held in a secure and encrypted vault. The targets are accessed by using variety of methods. Now for Windows, the same methods that we discussed in the previous slide will be used. However, Outpost has a capability of discovering everything that an appliance can discover. That is your Linux, your SNMP devices, your cloud infrastructure, storage devices, anything that an appliance supports can be discovered using the Outpost as well. So the targets are accessed by using variety of methods such as SSH, Telnet, WMI, SNMP, WBAM, and many different types of protocols that Discovery uses. Once logged onto the Discovery target, the BMC Discovery Outpost executes the commands to access the target details, and their results are encrypted and sent to the BMC Discovery appliance. Now, multiple outposts can be deployed to handle the segmented networks, and all these outposts can communicate with the same discovery appliance. So, one appliance can communicate with multiple outposts, and one outpost can communicate with multiple appliances. Outpost uses port 443 to communicate with the discovery appliance securely. Now let's look at the user permissions which are needed to specifically run the credential or AD proxy. Now, the credential proxy is mainly designed to discover the Windows endpoints which are in a workgroup based environment. And AD proxy is designed to discover the endpoints in a domain joined environment. Now, both can be installed on the same server. That is not an issue. However, if you want to add the Active Directory credential to run as a service, then you need to make sure that the server on which you are installing the credential proxy or AD proxy is joined to domain. A workgroup based machine will not be able to create an AD proxy because the domain user will not be known to it. Thus, the AD proxy must be installed on a server which is joined to the domain. The user that you will be using to perform discovery using the credentials or AD proxy must be a part of the administrators group. It should also have the permissions to run as a service because, as we mentioned earlier, when you install the credential proxy or AD proxy and add a credential in it, a service is created on the specific server and it runs as a service. So that is why run as a service permission is mandatory. Let's now understand about WMI and what permissions are needed when it comes to discovering the Windows endpoints using WMI only. Now, WMI, as we all know, it is Windows Management Instrumentation and it is a set of specifications from Microsoft for consolidating the management of devices and applications in a network from Windows computing systems. Now, WMI provides users with information about the status of the local or remote computer systems. The main purpose of WMI is to help administrators manage different Windows environments, including remote systems and local systems. WMI is pre installed on all the Windows operating systems. There is a GUI and CLI based access which is available so that the WMI can be managed. Now, just a little more about WMI is that WMI provides a COM API that allows access to management information about the status of the local or remote computer systems. Remote WMI connections are made through the distributed component object model, which is commonly known as DCOM. When a certain discovery method fails due to any reason, the fallback method is used as the RemQuery and PowerShell. Now, these are some of the permissions which I have mentioned. The reason I have specified DCOM remote access on the top is because remote WMI connections are made through the DCOM. WMI root sim v2 namespace should have remote enable, account enable permissions. WMI root default namespace should also have the remote enable, account enable, and execute permissions. WMI root WMI namespace should have remote enable and account enable permissions. Now, these are some of the common ports which are required for performing the scan using WMI. Now, most of the discovery users or discovery administrators assume that just having port 135 open is sufficient, and the DCOM port range, which I have specified in the end, is always ignored while meeting the prerequisite. As explained earlier, WMI provides a COM API that allows access to management information about the status of local or remote computer system. And that is why having these DCOM port range open is a must. As per Microsoft, there are ways wherein you can specify or you can configure a dedicated port for DCOM communication, but it has its own pros and cons. There are different monitoring applications or tools which also rely heavily on WMI communication. So, if any of your services or applications or tools are leveraging WMI and you have only specified a dedicated port for communication, then there might be a conflict in discovery and in any other tool, and or vice versa. So, before we look into the permissions and the ports needed to scan using RemQuery, let's understand what RemQuery is. RemQuery is a BMC Discovery's utility that uses the same basic approach as the Microsoft's PSExec tool. The credential proxy or outpost will copy the RemQuery executable to the admin share on the target device. Windows administrator access is required in this specific case because writing to the admin dollar is usually done by the administrator account. So once the executable file is copied to the admin dollar, the REM query will start as a service. Once the service is started on the target, the proxy then sends the public key to the REM query service, which generates an encryption key, encrypts it with the received public key, and then sends it back. The proxy then recovers the encryption key using its private key. From that point, all proxy to REM query communication is secured using the encryption key and an appropriate algorithm. REM query discovery uses AES encryption with a 256-bit key. The proxy communicates to the REM query service using a named pipe. The pipe is also secured so that only an administrator user can access it. That is why in the permissions, you need to make sure that permission to the admin share is enabled and admin shares are also enabled. Now there is a difference between having the permission and having the admin share enabled. So make sure both are met, and an administrator account is needed to access the administrative share. So that is why having a user which is a part of the local admin group will be mandatory. Now, although WMI is the standard mechanism for remote system integrations and management from Microsoft, some operations are still not possible using WMI. Now, if you remember in the previous slides, I mentioned that WMI and RemQuery are together. They are not separate methods. Though RemQuery alone can execute the commands and perform the scan, but WMI alone can't do that. So that is why in certain cases, RemQuery has to be used. So as I explained, there are some operations which are not possible using WMI, primarily netstat, data in core discovery, and any additional run commands or the file content extraction via patterns. Without RemQuery, it is not possible to determine the network connection information for the discovery targets, communication between the host and any other applications. This will be helpful while creating the application models. So additional discovery operations using RemQuery are typically for deeper software discovery, modeling and versioning. So these are some of the prerequisites which are needed for RemQuery along with these ports. Now the port requirements for RemQuery are lesser in comparison with the WMI. So in conclusion, an administrator account is needed to use both WMI and RemQuery. Now, this is an interesting part. We are going to see the installation of the credential proxy, AD proxy, and outpost. So that's the first thing which we are going to do on 3 different servers. We are then going to add the credentials in credential and AD proxy, and we will also be performing the credential test against those IP addresses. This is a Windows Server 2012 R2, and I'm going to use this as a credential proxy. Now remember, credential proxy and AD proxy, the installer for both is the same. Just to differentiate some of the common differences, I'm going to install it on different servers. And this specific server is not a domain joined machine, so I'm going to install the credential proxy on this specific server. So I'm logged into the Discovery UI, and at the time of this demo, 24.2 is the latest version. Let's go to Manage Outposts and Proxies. As you can see, currently I do not have any outposts or Windows proxies connected. So I will click on Windows proxies and download the installer. So there are no separate installers for a credential proxy or an AD proxy. It is a choice given to us, which we will see at the time of installation. So let's download the installer, and once it is downloaded, let's go to the download directory and try and install the application. All the default options can be customized, such as the installation directory and any other customizable setting. Click next. Next. So here is an option to create this server as an Active Directory proxy. But like I said, we are only going to do a credential proxy on this server. But in your case, you can combine both of them together, provided the server on which you are installing is also joined to domain to create an AD proxy. Click Next. So I'm going to create a credential proxy. You can enter the credential now or later as well. We are going to do it later. So let's click Next and install. The installation has started. We will just wait for the installation to finish. The installation is completed. Let's click on Finish and run the proxy manager. So by default, the credential proxy service runs with the local system account. And if I show the services MMC, we will see the same information. The BMC Discovery credential proxy is running with the local system account. So what we see on the proxy manager here is also visible in the services MMC. Now let's install the Active Directory proxy. So this is another server where I'm going to install the Active Directory proxy. Just to check whether this is joined to domain, let's go to properties. And yes, this server is a part of a domain. So I'm going to make this server an AD proxy. So I'm going to make this server an AD proxy. So I'm now logged into the Discovery UI. The procedure is the same. You have to go to Manage, Outposts and Proxies, go to Windows Proxies and download the installer. Save the file and let's run the installer. All the options are exactly the same. You just need to choose the right proxy, whether you want to use it as an AD proxy or credential proxy. So again, I'm going to select AD proxy without entering the credentials. Next, we're not going to create a credential proxy on this so that we can understand the difference between two and install. The installation is completed. Let's run the proxy manager. So as you can see here, it shows Active Directory. Again, it's running with the default local system account. And if we check the other server where we have installed the credential proxy, it shows as credential. And in an event you install both, that is Active Directory credential proxy and credential proxy together, you will see both of them on the same proxy page. Now let's install the Outpost on one of the servers. So this is a server 2022 which I have selected to install the Discovery Outpost service. Let's log in. Okay, now I'm going to select the Outposts section and download the installer. The Outpost installer is downloaded. Let's open it in a folder and install it. It is an MSI. For Windows proxy or AD proxy, the installer type is an executable file, and for Outpost, it is an MSI file. So you will only get an option to install, repair, or uninstall. So let's click on install. Click next. This is the default installation directory, which can be customized as per your requirement. As I discussed earlier, the default port which is used between Outpost and the Discovery appliance is port 443. This is the password which will be needed to access the Outpost web user interface. The way proxy has an interface, in the same way Outpost also has an interface, but it is a web based. Click next and install. The installation has started, and when you get the UAC prompt, click yes to continue. The installation is now completed successfully. Let's click on finish and launch the Discovery UI. the password that we typed earlier during the installation. And this is how the Outpost UI looks like. It doesn't have any additional details. The credentials is currently grayed out because you will only be able to add, edit, or delete the credentials when the Outpost is connected to any Discovery appliance. Now that we have installed the Credential proxy, AD proxy, and an Outpost, let's try to connect them with the Discovery appliance that we have. Okay, so I'm now on the Credential proxy. So when you go to edit and click on known appliances, you don't see any appliance currently connected to the Credential proxy. Let's click on plus to add or register a new appliance. Let's copy the appliance URL, or at least the host name. Type the appliance address and click contact. It will take the appliance name. As you can see, it's Discovery appliance visible right here, and the same name is detected when we are trying to register an appliance. Click on register. All the running proxy instances will be restarted, so click yes to continue. So once that is done, it will automatically launch the Discovery UI and will add all this information automatically. When you click on apply, the credential proxy will be registered with the Discovery appliance. Let's click apply. So now the credential proxy and the appliance connection is done successfully. In the same way, we are going to do it for the Active Directory proxy as well. This is the server where the AD proxy is running. So in the same way, we will copy the appliance host name, click on edit known appliances, add, let's contact the Discovery appliance and click register. Yes. And all the information is auto-filled. Let's click on apply. So here we have a credential pool and an Active Directory pool with the respective servers or with the respective credential proxy servers and AD proxy servers connected to it. Now connecting an outpost is a bit different process than what we just did. So let's go to our outpost server. So this is our outpost server, and the UI has an option to register an instance. So let's click on register an instance. So it will give us a token which we need to copy in Discovery UI, and we will get the token from Discovery UI and we need to share it in the Outpost UI. So let's do that. Copy. Let's go to Outpost and register an outpost. And I'm going to paste the token here. It has automatically detected the host name. Let's click on add. Until this token is exchanged, as in the token is copied to the Outpost UI, the connection will not be successful. So let's complete this step. So it has detected all the information. Let's click on add. The appliance and the Outpost connection is now successful. Let's try to refresh the Discovery UI. And we can see that the Outpost is still not connected as per what we see on the Discovery UI, and Outpost had just lost the connection. Now if you see here, earlier it was showing the host name as the actual host of the Discovery appliance, but now it has turned into localhost. Now this can be in several situations. The DNS server which is configured on the Outpost server is not able to resolve the names properly, or there is an incorrect entry in the DNS server against this specific IP, or there can be some misconfiguration done on the appliance side. Now as a temporary workaround, let's try to manually update the host name of the appliance on Discovery Outpost. So click on this little pen icon to edit, remove the incorrect name and type the correct name. Click OK and it will reinitiate the connection. So we'll just give it a few seconds. Yes, and instantly it has connected because we have now updated the correct host name of our Discovery appliance. And the Discovery UI is also now showing as successfully connected. So to confirm, we have successfully installed Credential proxy, AD proxy, and Outpost, and we have also successfully connected them with the Discovery appliance. Now let's go ahead with adding the credential. So let's first go to the Credential proxy. This is our Credential proxy. When I refresh, I'll be able to see all the latest information. When I go to Outpost, the Outpost is also connected. So adding the credential is a simple process. You just have to click on the create icon here, select credential, give it a meaningful name. So I'm going to add as Windows admin, and I'm going to select a specific user which is a part of the local administrators group and has the permission to run the local service. Enter the password. We have also selected to start the proxy immediately, because using this specific account there will be a dedicated service created and that service will be started immediately. And we also have to register this specific credential back to appliance, so we will choose register with the same Discovery appliance again, and you will see the difference when we do that. So click OK. Service is started successfully. If it fails right at this stage, the service would not start and the cross launch that it has done would also not work. So we are going to assign it to the same credential pool, and we are just going to name it as Windows admin so that we know that this specific proxy was created for our Windows admin account. Click apply. Okay, so with the same credential pool, we have this specific Windows admin proxy which is added. Now let's do the same for the AD proxy. This is our AD proxy. So let's click on add. We're going to say domain admin. The account that I'm going to use is a domain admin account, but we will try to add and we'll see if we encounter any issues. Let's type the password. Click on OK. In case you are using a GMSA type of account, then that can also be enabled right from here. In this case, we are not going to use GMSA account. This is just a standard domain account. And let's click OK. So this also has permissions to start the local service, and it is a part of the administrator group. So let's open the redirect URL here, and as you can see, it is now trying to create a new pool, but we will link it with the existing pool. So select it, click on apply, and we have it in the same pool. Now Discovery tried creating an additional pool as a part of this redirect that happened, so we can just delete since we are not going to use that. So now we have the credential proxy and AD proxy, and both their credentials are also added successfully. Now let's go to Outpost UI and try to add the credentials. So this is our Outpost, which is successfully connected to the appliance. Go to Manage and Credentials. The Outpost can also be cross-launched directly from the Discovery UI. So all you have to do is go to Manage Outposts and Proxies page and click on the respective outpost that you want to cross-launch. When you click on it, it will automatically redirect us to the Outpost UI. So currently Discovery is in stopped state, which it's reading from here. Discovery is in stopped state. If I click on Start All Scans here, the discovery will be in a running state, and the same status will be updated here as well. Let's go to manage credentials. Okay, currently we do not have any credentials, so I'm going to add a new Windows type of credential. This is our Windows admin. Click on apply. So the credentials are added successfully on Credential proxy, AD proxy, and on Outpost as well. Let's quickly perform the credential test and see how that looks like. So I'm going to start from the Outpost since we are already here. Click test just to make sure that the credentials which we have added are valid. So Outpost is performing the credential test. Until then, let's just switch to the Windows proxy and perform the test. So from the UI itself, you can perform the test. Click on Actions, Test, pass the IP, and click on Test. So on the credential proxy, the credential test has failed. Let's click on the failure message. So here it says Windows credential proxy, Windows admin cannot access this IP because there are no credentials configured on the Discovery UI. So let's go to manage credentials. So here we only have the credentials configured at the Outpost level. There are no credentials configured on the appliance. So let's click on add and configure Windows type of credential on the appliance. So I'm specifying that this is for proxy. The name doesn't mean that proxy will use the same credential. This is just to differentiate between all the credentials which we have entered. Click apply. Now let's do the credential test from the proxy page. Click on actions, test, pass the IP. Okay, so now the credential test is successful. This means that even when you have the credential proxy configured, and even when the proxy is running with the administrator account, the credential still needs to be created in Discovery UI. But this is not the case for the Active Directory credential proxy. We'll see that as well, but let's see what happened to the credential test which we had initiated on the Outpost. So the credential test on the Outpost is also successful. With that, let's perform a quick credential test on our AD proxy. Let's click on Actions and Test, pass the IP. So domain is also updated here. So that way you can differentiate which domain it is for. Click Test. The test is in progress. And with that, the Windows AD proxy credential test is also successful. Now, like I said earlier, you don't have to create an Active Directory type of credential in Discovery Appliance while using AD proxy. So when you go to manage credentials, you can see that we only have the admin credential, one created for proxy and one created on the Outpost. So this concludes the first demo where we installed Credential proxy, AD proxy, Outpost. We added the credentials and we performed the test credentials. Now that we have the credential proxy, AD proxy, and Outpost installed, we will now perform scan of an IP address which is not a part of the domain and one which is a part of a domain. So I'm going to temporarily disable the Outpost connection just to make sure that the scans which we will be initiating will be performed by the credential proxy and AD proxy without any conflict. Let's go to manage discovery, add a new run, and I'm going to scan two different IP addresses, and we have already performed the credential test as well for these IPs. Let's click on OK with the default options and wait for the scan to complete. Let's check the progress, and here we can see two successes. It means both the IPs are being scanned successfully using two credentials. Let's go to discovery access. So this one is using the AD pool, and let's check the other one, and that must be using the credential pool. Okay, so this confirms that when we have the Windows credentials configured, it uses WMI and RemQuery as the scanning methods. And when we check the other one where we have the AD proxy configured, it has used PowerShell as the primary method to perform the scan. Now we are going to see a demo about WMI and RemQuery. We are going to configure minimal WMI permissions and scan using an outpost. In the earlier demos, we used the administrative account because in the previous demos, we started the credential proxy and AD proxy using the administrator accounts, because the credential proxy and the AD proxy, they need administrative account to run the service locally. I'm now logged into one of the Windows servers. We are going to create a new user manually, and we are going to assign the permissions, the least permissions which are required to perform the scan using WMI method. So let's go to computer management, create a new user. Let's say we will call it as ADDM and set a password to it. The user is created. Let's configure the same credentials in the outpost and then perform the credential test. We'll create a Windows type of credential. Let's type the password. Let's retype the password. And create. Now let's configure the same credentials in the Discovery Outpost. Go to add the Windows type of credential and click apply. The credentials are created successfully, and we are now going to perform a credential test. We know it's going to fail, but we will still perform it just to make sure that what we are doing is correct. So we know that the credential test was attempted and it has failed. The user is just created, it is not a part of any administrative group. So what all permissions are needed if we want to successfully scan the host or that endpoint using the WMI method? So let's go back to the RDP session of that server and let's configure the credentials. Let's go to run and decom CNFG, which is the decom configuration page. Expand component services, computers, and right click on my computer, click on properties. Click on com security and click on edit limits under launch and activation permissions. Make sure that the user which you want to allow to perform WMI and decom activities or decom operations is a part of this specific launch and activation permission group. So let's click on add and add the ADDM user that we just created. Click OK and make sure that it has all these permissions enabled. Click OK and apply. Now the permissions that we just enabled are the decom permissions. Now let's set the WMI permissions. So let's go to run and type WMI mgmt.msc. So another way just to identify whether WMI is running locally or not before you start troubleshooting is you launch WMI mgmt console on the endpoint which might be failing to scan, and just right click on the WMI control local and click on properties. So this shows that it is connected to the local computer. It means WMI is working locally without any issues. Now that we are here in the WMI control local properties, let's go to security and expand the root object. Click on security and make sure that the user that we created is a part of this list. So click on add type the name, click OK. And the permissions that we need for WMI are remote enable, account enable for root sim v2. So let's enable them. Remote enable and account enable is also already enabled. Click on apply, OK. And in the same way, we are going to repeat the steps for the default namespace. And the permissions which we need for the default namespace are remote enable, account enable, and execute. Account enable is already there, remote enable and execute. Click apply. Let's repeat the same for root WMI namespace. The permissions we need is remote enable and account enable. Remote enable is there. Okay, account enable is enabled. Let's enable remote enable. Click apply. Okay. So now the WMI permissions are met. Let's go back to the discovery outpost and check that now we can successfully perform the credential test. And there you go. The credential test is successfully completed. It means we will be able to use the WMI method and perform the discovery. So now we are going to create a new discovery run and scan this specific IP, and let's see the result just to compare when WMI and RemQuery both are enabled versus the scanned result of when only WMI is enabled. IP address of the same host, and we are going to explicitly choose the outpost to perform the scan, and we'll call it as a WMI only scan. Click OK and wait for the scan to complete. Let's open the scan, and okay, it has completed. Let's open the discovery access, and if you see, all the access methods are only WMI. So if you remember, initially I mentioned that WMI and RemQuery go hand in hand. RemQuery, it's though it is also considered as a fallback method, it is also an additional method which is executed along with WMI, because certain scripts cannot be executed, certain commands cannot be executed just by using WMI. So this is the drawback of only using WMI. So only using WMI, though it helps you infer the host, but is not useful because you might be missing on some key information while your daily IT operations are running. So this concludes the demo on how to use WMI with minimal permissions needed and scan using the outpost. Let's now move to the next part, which is about PowerShell. Like I mentioned earlier, PowerShell is nowadays becoming very popular, and the reason it's very popular is because configurations that we have to do in PowerShell and the prerequisites which we have to meet while using the PowerShell method are lesser and easier compared to WMI and RemQuery. So for PowerShell also, you need the administrator privileges, and these are only two ports which are needed. One is HTTP and one is HTTPS. So PowerShell remoting is a WinRM based and does not use DCOM. By default, PowerShell remoting requires the administrator privileges. It is also possible to enable PowerShell remoting for non-admin users, but those manual steps are far complex than what we just did for WMI. So once you have established a remote session, the user will still need permissions to execute the PowerShell commandlets. The default PowerShell scripts are similar in operation to existing Windows Discovery code and continue to use commands such as getSim instances, which in turn uses WMI. So for that, you need to make sure that WMI is running locally. You don't have to have the DCOM port range to allow for that to happen. Only using these two PowerShell ports, the discovery scan will still happen. The best part of using PowerShell is configuring a smaller number of ports compared to WMI and RemQuery both combined together. There is no dependency of using a Windows or a credential proxy or AD proxy or even an Outpost server. Even the Discovery appliance can directly perform the scan of the Windows endpoints when you're using PowerShell as the default method. Now, apart from the default PowerShell method where the administrator privileges need to be enabled, there is a new concept which Microsoft has introduced, and that is called as PowerShell JEA, which is just enough administration. Now, what Windows JEA actually helps you for? Now, Windows JEA enables administrators to permit the non-administrator users to execute specific commandlets and external processes without granting them full administrative privileges. So by using JEA in BMC Discovery, you can discover Windows hosts without providing the credentials with full administrator access. JEA is supported for the following credential types, that is PowerShell and Active Directory Windows proxy. There are certain prerequisites that need to be met for JEA to work. So it only works with PowerShell 5.0 or Windows Management Framework 5.1 installed on the target hosts. JEA must be configured on the target Windows hosts. JEA sessions must have the following configuration. Now we will be performing a demo. We will scan a Windows endpoint using PowerShell user account. We have already performed it by using the AD proxy. So we are going to perform it using the Discovery appliance. We are on the Discovery appliance. Let's go to credentials. Let's edit the same credentials which we already have on the appliance. And we are going to add PowerShell as the credential type, enable HTTP as well on it, click on apply, and now perform the credential test. Let's click on actions, test, and the credential test that we just performed right from the appliance is now completed successfully. We are going to perform a scan of this specific IP using the appliance, and we'll see whether the PowerShell discovery works successfully directly from the appliance. We are going to choose this appliance as the source of scanning. Let's give it a label of PowerShell. We can enable session logging. Session logging is enabled for SSH and PowerShell where a session is established. Click OK, and we'll wait for the scan to finish. So even if we review the session results, we can see that the successful PowerShell connection as the admin account. It has successfully connected to the remote endpoint, and it has almost successfully completed the scan of this specific endpoint. So scan is now completed successfully, and the results are also promising. It has almost executed all the methods successfully, and the access type is PowerShell. So for the next demo, we are going to work on creating a PowerShell JEA type of user account and enable JEA permissions with some specific commandlets that Discovery is going to execute. I am now logged into a Windows Server 2022, and I have opened PowerShell ISC with the administrator privileges. We are now going to perform a few steps which will create certain capability file, and it will also define which specific user will have access to what we are defining or what we are going to define in this specific capability file. So to start with, I'm first going to create 3 different folders which have their own purposes to store the JEA session configuration. Some will save the JEA capability file, and some will have the information about the JEA discovery session transcript. So we have 3 directories created. We are going to create a file name with an extension PSRC, which is used for PowerShell role capability file. And then there will be a PSSC file, which is known as a PowerShell session configuration file. And this file is used to define a JEA endpoint. the session configurations determine who is allowed to access the JEA endpoint and what role or roles they will be able to access. Okay, so let's run the next script. This will actually create a specific file with .psrc, which I mentioned about as the PowerShell role capability file. Okay, let's go into our directory. So we have JEA discovery directory and a PSRC file created. Let's go back to PowerShell terminal. Now we are going to create a new user. If you have an existing user, you can use the existing user as well. Only for this demo, I'm going to add a new user called as JEA discovery user. Enter the password. Okay, the user is created. Now let's now create a new group, and we are going to add the JEA discovery user to this group, and this group will have the permissions which we are going to allow or use in JEA. Okay, the user is added in the group. We can verify it here when we go into groups. Okay, the group is discovery JEA, and the JEA discovery user is a part of this group. Okay, let's verify that the file is created. So the session configuration file is created. Now let's test the PS configuration, and that is successful. Let's restart the WinRM service to make sure the changes which we have applied are effective. We are now going to enable the PS remoting with force parameter. That is done successfully. Now we are going to register the PS session configuration file that we created with a name, and this is a name that we have specified called as discovery JEA, and this is very important because we need to pass this value in discovery UI when we will be configuring the JEA type of credentials. So let's enter that and wait for it to complete. Okay, this is completed successfully. Let's log back into the discovery UI. Okay, we are logged into the discovery UI. Let's go to manage credentials. So I have disabled the admin account that we had used earlier to perform the PowerShell discovery. Let's add a new PowerShell type of credential, and we'll specify a name as PowerShell JEA. It is JEA discovery user and its password. So this is important. When you enable just enough administration, you have to give the endpoint name, and the endpoint name is referring to this name that we have passed in the very last command that we executed. So let's copy that and update it here. If the endpoint name is typed incorrectly, then also JEA discovery will fail. Let's click apply. Okay, we are now going to perform a credential test using this PowerShell JEA account that we have created. Again, just to show you, this JEA discovery user is only a part of discovery JEA group and not the local administrators group. So that way we know that it is not an admin account, but it has certain permissions or privileges which we have given, and it will do it accordingly. Let's test the credentials against this IP. And that is successful. When you click on success, you will be able to see that JEA is enabled using the configuration name, and we are able to also access PowerShell using the same account where the JEA is enabled for. So let's perform a quick discovery scan of this IP and see how the discovery looks like or what change we see. We are going to use our appliance for this. Let's click OK. So here we can see that the PowerShell JEA credentials are used, and it has successfully executed the first method, and the discovery is still in progress. Okay, it has almost successfully executed all the remaining methods as well. So this concludes the demo on using PowerShell JEA account and performing a scan using discovery appliance. Now the last method that we are going to see is the SNMP method. Now, though SNMP can be used to discover Windows endpoints, like I mentioned earlier, this is the least used method to scan the Windows endpoints. And there are some prerequisites which I have mentioned here. The UDP port 161 needs to be opened. SNMP service needs to be enabled on the specific Windows server that you are going to discover. A read-only community string needs to be enabled or created, and the server should also accept the SNMP packets. Now, if you remember, I mentioned about having some drawbacks. So we will discuss that when we actually going to perform the demo. The only high level disadvantage which I want to mention is Windows servers only support SNMP version 2 and not version 3. So that is why the SNMP method is not so secure to use on the Windows servers. Now let's see the demo on how to configure the SNMP service and scan using the SNMP user account in BMC Discovery. So this is one of the Windows server on which I have already connected through RDP, and we are going to fulfill the first prerequisite, and that is to enable the SNMP service. So let's go to server manager and add the SNMP service. Click next, and it's a feature, so we are going to select a feature, not a role. So here is the SNMP service. Click add feature, next, and install. The installation is now completed successfully. Click close and launch the services MMC. So look for the service called as SNMP service. Open the service and let's go to security. So here you get an option to add a community string. So click add. So discovery only needs the read-only permissions. So just select read-only and give a community name. So I'm going to give it a community name of ADDM Discovery. Click on add. You can also restrict the SNMP packet arrival only from specific hosts, or you can accept the SNMP packets from any host. So that is up to your requirement. Let's click on apply. Okay. I'm going to go back into the Discovery UI. Go to manage credentials, and we are going to add a new SNMP credential on the appliance. So it's a version 2 and we know the community string ADDM Discovery. Click apply. Let's now try to perform the credential test. And the credential test using SNMP, it's successful. It's showing us this is object ID and the basic information about the operating system. Let's now try to discover this endpoint using SNMP, and then we will understand why it is not so reliable way to discover Windows endpoints using SNMP method. Okay, let's go to Discovery Access. Looks like the Discovery had sent the request to Active Directory pool, and that is why the scan is happening using WMI and RemQuery here. Let's disable the AD pool and the credential pool we have temporarily. And let's try to rescan using SNMP. So now we can see that SNMP version 2 is being used. There are certain methods which will fail because SNMP will not be able to execute certain commands to fetch the list of services or to identify the process connection to certain ports or certain IPs. And none of the additional discovery methods will work because most of the additional discovery methods are connected to the patterns which discovery executes. So this is a major drawback. Inferring a host is not a challenge, but as I mentioned, you will be missing on the key information if you only scan using SNMP version 2 which is not so reliable method, but it is one of the supported methods to discover the Windows endpoints. So this concludes the demo on configuring the SNMP service and scan using SNMP user account in BMC Discovery. Let's now look at some of the troubleshooting methods or mechanism that we use while troubleshooting any scan failures. Especially we are talking about the Windows scan failures. It is important to validate the port status whenever we troubleshoot the Windows endpoint discovery issue. As I mentioned earlier as well, port 135 is just a way to identify that the endpoint is a Windows device. It doesn't mean that just by having port 135 open will be able to perform the discovery successfully. Most of the time there are WMI failures which are observed. So testing and validating the remote WMI connectivity using tools like WBEM test or WMIC. Now WBEM test is a graphical tool which is available, and WMIC is a command line tool available. So you need to perform these tests from an outpost or credential proxy or Active Directory proxy to the target device. In case you are performing a scan using an appliance, then WMI will not be used. In case of PowerShell failures, testing and validating the remote PowerShell connectivity, whether the endpoint supports HTTP type of connection, which is considered as insecure connection. You can try performing the enter PS session to ensure that you are able to remotely connect to the endpoint using PowerShell. Enter PS session can be performed from an outpost or from an AD proxy. You can check the status of the WinRM on the target device, whether WinRM is configured successfully or not. So in summary, we focused on many different methods which are used to discover the Windows endpoints. We have installed the supporting components such as Windows or Credential proxy, AD proxy, and Outpost. We configured different types of credentials like Windows credential, AD credential, PowerShell, SNMP, and we scanned using WMI, RemQuery, PowerShell, and PowerShell JEA. We also performed a scan using SNMP and found why SNMP is not so reliable method and why it should not be used. The installation and the configuration of user from scratch, we did it for WMI and JEA, because for REST you need to make sure that you have the administrator account configured to perform the scans. These are some of the important references which will be useful while troubleshooting the Windows discovery. Mainly the WMI discovery failures need to be identified and worked upon at the endpoint level. Majority of the times the issue is either with the account. In some cases, despite of having all the permissions assigned, the credential test or discovery or even WBEM test fails with access denied. I have seen these kind of issues mainly when WMI or remote decom communication is restricted by any utility or by using the group policy objects. And with that, I conclude my webinar. Thank you very much for joining.